Chapter 17 is our second of only two chapters that's looking at period 6, or that period between the end of the Civil War and about the turn of the 20th century that we refer to generally as the Gilded Age. Chapter 17 is going to look at really the last 10 years of the Gilded Age at some major social and political changes for the United States that are very much the results of the industrialization that we talked about so much in the previous chapter. Essential question 1 is, what were the origins and significance of populism? First, it's really valuable to remember that organization that I talked about in the previous chapter, the Grange, as small farmers, mostly in the West and in the South, who faced economic insecurities, similar to that of industrial workers, were blaming railroads and banks for economic hard times. They blamed railroads for their high freight rates that they charged to transport their goods, and they blamed banks because of the high interest rates that they would charge for land or tools or fertilizer, etc. And the Grange organized farmers in the South and the West, and they were able to get some laws passed called Granger Laws that were able to regulate, to a certain extent, railroad freight rates. The Grange is going to kind of evolve into another organization called the Farmers Alliance. And the Farmers Alliance tried to improve farmers' conditions through cooperative financing, or helping one another finance their own farming operations. They would later call for the government to establish something called sub-treasuries, which would allow farmers to store their crops until they sold them. They could also use these stored crops, theoretically, as collateral for low-interest government loans. As a result, they wouldn't have had to rely on banks anymore. And the sub-treasury plan is what actually leads the Farmers Alliance into politics. So the Grange has sort of evolved into the Farmers Alliance, which, with the sub-treasury plan, evolves into a political movement called the People's Party, which is also known as the Populists. And they form in the early 1890s. And they had a political platform or a set of beliefs or policies that were very progressive for the time. Of course, this platform included the sub-treasury plan that we talked about, but it also included a graduated income tax, which is the idea that the more you make, the higher your tax rate is. They also called for public ownership of railroads and telegraph lines to be operated for the public good rather than being operated for profit. And they also called, and this is very important, they also called to increase the money supply through the coinage of free silver, or to make the dollar based on not only gold but also silver. And that means that money would be more available, meaning that it would be easier for farmers to repay their debts. And we'll talk more about this in a minute, because it is very important in understanding the populists and the political changes that happened in the last decade of the Gilded Age. But the populists tried to form a coalition of farmers, urban workers, African Americans, and women to compete with the other two major parties in national elections. And in fact, a severe economic depression called the Panic of 1893 created an opportunity for the populists to expand the populist vote because of the increased conflict between labor and business that resulted from this panic. And other than the Great Depression in the 1930s, the Panic of 1893 is arguably the worst economic depression the United States goes through. And you do have widespread calls for the government to do something about this. One great example is Coxey's Army. Coxey's Army was a collection of workers who marched on Washington, D.C. to demand economic relief by the government. And remember, the government is using laissez-faire policies at this time. The government does not get involved to solve economic crises or depressions like this. And ultimately, Coxey's Army will be violently dispersed by U.S. soldiers. Also, in regards to this conflict, or this increasing conflict between management and labor, I want to cite two major strikes during the 1890s that are important to know alongside the Great Uprising from 1877. Keep in mind, though, they're separated by about 20 years. Nonetheless, the Homestead Strike takes place in 1892. And this was a strike against Carnegie Steel at their Homestead plant. Carnegie here crushed their union, the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, by not renewing their contract. They thus go on strike at Homestead, Pennsylvania steel plant, and the state actually brings in militiamen to crush the strike. And again, this is an example of how labor strikes and then government is openly hostile to it. And the Homestead Strike and really the defeat of the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers is a major blow to the organized labor movement. The other example is one that the textbook talks about here, and that's the Pullman Strike in 1894. Here, again, we see a company cut wages as the Pullman Company, which is a railroad company, cut wages to their workers while maintaining the same price for rent and prices in a company town that those workers lived in. The workers, as a result, go on strike, and this strike halted a substantial portion of U.S. railroad commerce. Ultimately, though, we see again government be openly hostile to this strike as President Grover Cleveland used federal troops to crush the strike. In the process, strike leaders, rather leaders of the Pullman Strike like Eugene V. Debs, were arrested. And this arrest was upheld by an 1895 Supreme Court case in re Debs. I only mention Debs here because he will become an important socialist leader who will run in several U.S. presidential elections. We'll talk more about him later, but he's useful to go ahead and bring up now. But the defeat of strikers at the Homestead Strike and the defeat of the strikers at the Pullman Strike are both major blows to the labor movement, and potentially these are opportunities for populists to pick up more voters in this coalition they're trying to create between farmers, urban workers, African American, and women. And the 1896 presidential election marked the biggest opportunity for the populists, but also their ultimate failure. Both the populists and the Democrats supported a candidate named William Jennings Bryan for president. And the big issue around this election became either basing money on the gold standard, as Republicans wanted, or basing it on free coinage of silver, which the Democrats supported, but as we know was also part of the populist platform because that would make money more available, which would make it easier for farmers to pay off their debts. And William Jennings Bryan had given this really rousing speech called the Cross of Gold speech, where he denounces basing money on the gold standard and supports free coinage of silver. And the populists really support the same candidate that the Democrats do because they realize that he has the best chance of winning because he would have the support of both the populists and one of the two major parties, the Democrats. On the other hand, the Republicans support a candidate named William McKinley, who, like the rest of the Republican Party, supported the gold standard for U.S. money. Ultimately, he out-fundraised and outspent William Jennings Bryan, largely due to contributions from large trusts, monopolies, and other business interests who also supported the gold standard. This was a hotly contested convention, but ultimately, William McKinley from the Republicans wins. The Democrats lose, but live to fight another day. But the populists disintegrate. The coalition that they tried to create by not winning in 1896, that coalition begins to fall apart, and the populists aren't going to run another major candidate for office after the 1896 election.